Good morning. It's about 9:30 on a Friday. TGIF, everyone. Hope everyone's doing good. This is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic. Hello, YouTubers, witches and wizards. So, yeah, this is the next video in my first first complete installment of a video series of a really great and beloved franchise of mine. And I'm up to part 5. So this is the Friday the 13th franchise extravaganza. I'm going to work at the conclusion of all of these videos and coverage of all of the movies. I'm working on trying to get a cool possible interview with someone who was like directly involved with the filmmaking of these movies. It might be a little bit tough, but I'm going to try to do that. I got a ways to go on these movies, so I have quite a bit of time, and I figured it would be if I can land something like that, that would be a really cool kind of cap off of this whole kind of this whole kind of horror odyssey or saga. I've never done a full franchise before. I've done, obviously, I mean, do tons of movies, and I've done like sequels and groups of movies. I've done, I think I did some videos on the Marvel movies and, other things that are obviously part of a franchise per se, or they are part of a franchise. But I've never done like a consecutive movie after movie that's involved with a franchise, especially something as big and as bold as the Friday the 13th franchise, which is uh, pretty intense when you think of that there's actually 13 movies. So I got a ways to go, and I'm having a blast. And again, this whole idea kind of was spurred on, or the idea that kind of sparked this interest of doing this was, or the event that sparked this interest was, the news of that there's going to be probably by the end of this year or early next year, probably more so next year, that there's going to be another Friday the 13th movie, and the franchise is going to kind of continue. So that kind of piqued my interest, and I'm a huge fan of the franchise. Obviously, a lot of the times when it comes to certain movies, I feel like that become franchises. I feel like they reach a point of where they're kind of beating a dead horse, and they're just trying so hard to milk it and milk it and milk it. And obviously, that's the idea of a franchise, to like milk, a certain audience or demographic, because there's obviously a demand for it. So you keep turning them out. They keep churning them out. The studio keeps churning them out. And that's the idea of it. But a lot of the times, it's like the quality really, for the most part, gets pretty bad, and the consistency. The One of my favorite franchises. It might be my favorite franchise outside of this series, the Friday the 13th. And I actually think it's a rare case that, for instance, like the Purge movies. I'm a huge fan of the Purge franchise. And I've seen all of them. I just saw the last one that came out. It was probably this year, earlier this year. And the one thing, and I think, how many are there? I think there's like 5 or 6 of them. And I feel like that's a really rare franchise. I think that one is definitely one of the best, and I almost feel in a lot of ways that with that franchise in particular, each movie almost gets better over the years. And one of the cool things I noticed that they do with that franchise is they space out the movies. They don't. They come out every couple of years or 3 years. They don't like with this Friday 13th franchise. They literally came out, you know, to a degree like a movie every year or every 2 years. But for the most part, almost every year. So they were just like pumping them out, pumping them out. But with the Purge movies, I noticed that there's like a little bit of space. There's been, a few years. Like with the last one that came out, there was I think like 4 years or something like that. But one of the things I love about that franchise is that there's always they give you something really new, and the writing is really great, and there's like this level of realism, escapism, and they can really keep this level of suspense. And I find, at least for my taste, they keep you really engaged, and they always give you something different, like a different kind of view of what the essence of the story is, and it keeps you really engaged. At least it has for me, and that's probably my favorite franchise overall, especially for like the modern kind of thing. With, and I've talked about it before with the Marvel universe. Like I'm a huge comic book nerd fan, and I'm definitely a Marvel guy. I love some of the DC characters. I mean, Batman is my favorite character of all time, and of course he's DC. They and they've done some really great things, but I feel like the Marvel universe is a little bit more consistent. Well, with DC, I felt with the latest installment of the Batman movie that came out with Robert Patterson that came out this year, I feel like they really knocked it out of the park with that movie. That's so many great Batman films, particularly around Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan. But for me, I kind of feel like, and I love the Tim Burton movies, but for me, I personally, I feel like the Robert Patterson one overall is probably my favorite of all of the big screen adaptations of Batman. I did a show on that a while back. I got to see that in the theater, and that was pretty amazing. And I bought that on Blu-ray. Huge fan. And the other Marvel movie, or sorry, DC movie that there's two, but the Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, really amazing film. And I feel like both of those films are like they're so well done and so well crafted. They're kind of standalone films. Like you could go into them, either of those films, not knowing really much about any of the mythology, which I feel is like a strength of the writing. A good tight script and and using a really well uh, seasoned or a real talented director with a really great vision can do that. And I actually like the last Zack Snyder Justice League, the extended cut. I like that a lot. I think it's the best thing that Zack Snyder's ever done. It's the one that's essentially was two parts. It's 4.5 hours long. I just recently watched that over a buddy's house a couple weeks ago, and I've seen it actually a few times now, and it's great. I think it's easily the best thing Zack Snyder's ever done. But anyway, going back to the franchise idea with the Marvel thing, and I know a lot of people have complained about it, and I understand it, but there's a sense of, because that franchise is probably the biggest franchise in the universe, and it's kind of never ending. There's a certain, and even for me being, I'm a huge fan of the Marvel movies, but there's been a sense or a level of like fatigue around how many, because of the level and how many films do come out, so it's kind of overwhelming. And the last few films, I feel like they've kind of gone off the tracks a little bit. I haven't seen the new Thor movie or the new Doctor Strange, but I've heard and those I do want to see, but I've heard that those films were not on par with the the previous films, not as good. But I did really enjoy and love the last Spider-Man. I thought that was a really great movie, awesome movie. But there's a level of fatigue that happens with franchises, and so there's like this thing that happens. But I feel like with Friday the 13th, because it's you can't really take it serious. It's not you can't take it too seriously, and it's like got a level of camp and fun to it that it is a little bit easier to kind of digest, and it's something I crave, and I feel like that's at least what those aspects has they've kept the franchise kind of exciting because there's so many movies, and now that there's news of more coming out, it's kept the for at least me it's kept the interest because they obviously they have a formula, but the later movies in the franchise I feel like they did some really interesting kind of creative things around the story, but I feel like they keep an aspect of fun, and they don't take themselves too seriously. Like there's a formula that they stick with, but they've definitely tried new things, but it's taken and it's taken or really shown through a more of a pure escapist kind of lens. It's a they're kind of silly, fun, and they're just like good popcorn movies, and they what I think generally they deliver what they say they're gonna show you and what they're gonna deliver you as a fan. Great kills and lots of teenagers getting slaughtered and all that fun stuff. I mean, who doesn't love that? So, cheers. And I want to thank everybody for the support. It's cool to see that the YouTube channel is growing. It's I did a show last week on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I noticed that one was pretty big. A lot of people have been checking it out, and there's certain videos up on the YouTube channel that have been getting more and more views and interest and comments. So I appreciate this is still a new thing for me, so I'm trying to improve on it and crank out content. Hopefully, it's quality content. I'm trying to give like I've said before, these movies have been talked about, to the point of where you can almost be, sick of hearing about it. So I wanted to try to give maybe a little bit of a different, shed a little bit of a different light or have a little bit of a different perspective as opposed to talking about the same old things that make these movies what they are, certain key points. I wanted to try to give it maybe a little bit of a different angle, talk about a few different things, and then also try to show, like how much these films have meant to me and continue to kind of inspire me. So yeah, and I've talked about it before, the tremendous influence that these movies have had and films in general have on my band Quantum. And I really think, music and movies obviously are a huge inspiration, bands I really love. But and I'm discovering like getting back to like the music aspect of it. I always I typically always go back to my favorite period of music of music that I always go back to is music from the 70s and 80s, and then also a lot of the older like Blue Note jazz records from like the 50s and early 60s. So I listen to stuff like I listen to tons of Miles Davis. That's a huge inspiration for me. I listen to lots of Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis quintet stuff. Tony Williams is my, I attempt to, play music for a living and be a musician. And so my biggest influence has always been Tony Williams. Like for me, there's so many great players. I mean, the list is too big to to run off all the names that would be on that list. But Tony Williams for me is like the man, the god. He was so innovative and exciting and just had this ferocity in his playing and just so musical. He had everything. And I love that he had all of this incredible technique, like his arsenal of technique and his like chops, like his ability to like express himself was, you know, of the highest caliber, but he had this rawness to his playing. So it felt like if it was somebody different who didn't have that kind of approach, it would sound more, I don't know, to a degree technical and less organic. But he had this ferocity to his playing where I feel like to a degree when it came to performing, he was all about the music and it was all about the listening experience to his fellow musicians. And he kind of, I felt like he threw out his technique and he just would play and just had this rawness. Other players like that, guys like Elvin Jones, one of my other favorite drummers of all time, where they just had this level of ferocity and intensity, and they obviously were, just amazing technicians when it came to the technical application of their instruments. But they were so in the moment, and they just had this ferocity to their playing, and they just had this really raw approach. Like everything wasn't perfect, everything wasn't. Um, Meticulously planned out per se. It was like they were reacting and using their ears, and it was all about benefiting the music and the greater good of what was going on in their musical situations. It wasn't about their own kind of thing. It was about the collective. And both those drummers, in particular, Tony Williams, really propelled that band, the Miles Davis Quintet, through all of the different things that they explored sonically and texturally and melodically. I feel like every time I listen to them, and in particular Tony Williams, like he was that the like kind of the engine, and he was like propelling the band and pushing them in these directions all the time. But yet it all made sense, and it was all about the collective. It was He never stood out as the guy who's the cliche thing of the musician who's like playing a lot of notes or maybe playing too many notes or he's playing a little bit too loud or it was all this collective, and he was just pushing the sound into like new heights of beauty and rawness and intensity, and just the most inspiring player. And when I listen to I just I listen to different albums from that period with the quintet, Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter, Ron Carter and Miles and Tony. I listen to that band. I mean, almost every week in some form, some capacity, whether it's like a live album or a studio album. My favorite album of theirs, of that quintet, is Nefertiti. That is definitely like what you could say is like my one of my desert island albums. Like if I was stranded on an island, that would be the album. And then my favorite live album of that band is Live at the Plug Nickel. It's such an intense album, and they really took the songs from the studio world that they played or that they recorded. They took them into just completely new height, the whole like just completely different to new heights. They reached this kind of apex in a live setting with those tunes and that material. The interesting thing too about when I discovered Miles, and when I was getting exposed to jazz, it was a funny process because when I went to Berkeley, initially, like, the whole story was like I was probably in maybe ninth, 10th grade, and I had just studied. I was playing drums. I started playing drums when I was like 11 or 12, I think. I had got my first drum set. I played guitar. I had gotten a guitar when I was younger, when I was like 11, 10 or 11. I had gotten a guitar, and I was taking lessons for a few years. And I used to go to this little studio in this music shop that was by my house. And the and I took lessons, but I never practiced, and I always liked guitar. And I was playing, I was really into, during the whole period, I was really into a lot of metal. I got into, first it was like bands like Kiss and obviously Black Sabbath. And then I got into, like Led Zeppelin. And then I was also, you know, it was during the time when the hardcore scene was still happening in New York. I grew up in New York, so like the hardcore scene was like kind of the tail end of that. But I got into really extreme music after that. I got into like Slayer and Anthrax and Megadeth. I got into all the whole thrash metal scene, and then I got more into the kind of the European death metal scene. I got into bands like Therion and then bands like Morbid Angel, Obituary. But I was also like into a lot of the hardcore music that was still around. It was kind of the tail end. It was the 90s, but there was still like the tail end of the hardcore scene that was going on in New York. I was really into like Minor Threat and Sick of It All, Biohazard, which was like a newer band at the time, Bad Brains. So I was into a lot of that stuff too. Um, and I used to go to hardcore shows as well as metal shows, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great period, and right at that time I was playing guitar. The funny thing is like I was taking these lessons at this local music shop, and the guitar teacher was actually the same teacher that was teaching. I believe his name was Dan Spitz, who was the guitar player for Anthrax. So that was like pretty wild. And I remember when they got huge, that store like was like kind of popular all of a sudden because they were Dan Spitz had taken guitar lessons there. So it was cool. But around that time, my thing was is I never practiced. I always, I barely practiced. I would show up to my guitar lessons and I would, not really have anything together for my weekly lesson. And and then I don't know what it was, but I started to look into drum set. I was like, what is this? This looks like fun. I always liked drums and rhythm, and I was getting into more extreme music and heavier music. And I was also, you know, I was pretty open minded. I think at the time, I was really my first electronic album that I ever got. Like I was a huge Depeche Mode fan when I was a kid too, and I remember getting Violator on cassette. And to this day, they're one of my favorite bands. And David Gahan is my favorite vocalist of all time from Depeche Mode. But I got into Depeche Mode when I was really a young kid, and I remember having getting Violator when it basically came out, and it was a long, long time ago. But I was a little kid, so I was really into that, and then that was like the first time I got exposed to electronic music. And then I had, I've talked about this a little bit before, but I had friends that were also DJs, and they were doing, you know, more like techno mixes of music. It was right when like the harder techno stuff was kind of emerging and kind of hitting America, and they were DJing and they were making all these mixtapes of all of this electronic music. So I got really into like techno at that time. I was also, because I grew up in New York, there was a lot of hip hop around, a lot of rap music. So I was really into like Public Enemy and, uh, you know, uh, the Beastie Boys, KRS-One and Cypress Hill, and so I was, I was predominantly like a metalhead kid, but I was into a lot of music that was non-metal. So I was like, I was pretty open-minded. And but anyway, so I took guitar lessons, and then I eventually got into drums, and I started taking lessons with a teacher who was really great. And I remember I studied with him for quite a while, and his name was David Christopher, and I studied with him for about probably 2 or 3 years, and it was great, but it was really hard. We worked on a lot of technique and all those kinds of things. And one of the goals that he had mentioned for me to try to maybe shoot for was to he had mentioned that there was a like a this big national or statewide national like statewide snare drum competition. He's like, maybe we could work on that material and you can enter it and see how you do. And basically it's all like a series of where you go in front of these judges and these teachers, and you perform all of these rudiments, and you basically talk about or you basically perform these in front of these teachers like these etudes and these various snare drum rudiments and exercises, and then they'll like judge you, and then you can get like certificate, and it might like help you to when you if you decide to like go to some kind of music school, it might help like with using that as a little bit of a like credential. So I decided to do that, and I remember we spent you know every practice was like we were working heavily on like rudiments and things like pertaining to that. So we worked, for a long time, and we worked about 6 or 7 months on a lot of this stuff. And my thing too, I was really young, and I wasn't. I did practice. I started getting into practicing, but I was really a slacker. I was a kid, so I was like really. I loved what I was doing and loved the work behind it, but I was not really motivated to like put in the time. And I remember it was funny because my dad at that time he played piano, and my uncle was a trumpet player who played in the military, and he was really the only other musician that I knew of in my family. But my dad started playing piano. He used to play when he was a kid, and then when I was in high school, he started playing all the time. And he did it as a hobby. He would like, play. He got to a point where he was like playing 4 hours a day. And I remember always coming home from school, and he would always be downstairs at the house, and I could always hear him playing piano. And and at one point when I started taking lessons, and about 6 or 7 months into it, he realized I wasn't really, I would have my friends over and we would jam and have rehearsals, and we started doing a few gigs around the New York area, you know, but I wasn't really like it was hard for me to focus and practice, like sit down and practice. And I remember him giving me a hard time about that. He was like, the more you put into this, the better you'll get. You need to put in more time or be a little bit more focused. And and I slowly started to take that advice, and he would like push it, on me, and which was great. But over time, I started practicing a little bit more, and I was like working a lot more on these lessons. And eventually, I did the competition, and I did okay. I actually like performed. I got like an outstanding mark on my critique, and I got a little certificate. And I basically showed up to this like school that was rented out by this drumming organization, and you sign up and you go in and you wait on this line, and you go in and there's like 3 or 4 teachers there, and you play through all these rudiments, and then they just kind of critique you and let you know how you did. And it was good. I did it, but I worked pretty hard, especially towards the end of that. But again, I wasn't really a serious practicer, and I just didn't really do it. And around that time, a year or so after I started taking lessons with David Christopher, I was really, thinking about my future and what I wanted to do. And my dream became, my goal was to like go to Berklee College of Music, because I had heard about it for a long time, and I was like, wow, like that's, That's the most amazing music school. It's expensive. It's ungodly expensive now, but it's an insanely expensive school. So I was like, what could I do to try to get there and to go? So, and he was, my teacher was like, well, if you can't get into that school, you can, there was a couple other colleges. There was like, I think there was a school in New York City, like the New York University, which had a great music program. There was Five Towns College, which was another school that was close to me. That was another music school. But Berkeley for me was like, that was it. Like I really wanted to get there. And so, but I had no idea what that entailed. I just was a kid and I had no idea what that entailed. And my parents were, into it. So I decided to keep up my lessons. And it was funny because years and years later, my teacher, I realized, and I had no idea who it was, but my teacher, David Christopher, was like, he would tell me who this guy was, and I had no idea because I was never exposed to jazz at that time. But he was really great friends with Joe Morello, and he would occasionally do fill in gigs for Joe Morello. And Joe Morello is, one of the greatest drummers ever. I didn't realize who he was until years and years later, actually, until I was at Berkeley. Played with Dave Brubeck, the infamous, the famous Take Five drum solo, one of the first drum solos where they used odd meters. It was in a 5/4 time signature, and he, you know, legendary. He's up there with Buddy Rich and stuff. But so I had no idea who he was. But anyway, so I applied for Berkeley, and I had terrible grades in school. I did pretty good my last year, and my GED average, my grade point average was too low, so I didn't get accepted. But at the time, Berkeley offered a summer program. So, and they said if you could go to this, and if you do pretty well or get by, you could be eligible to become enrolled as a regular student. So I jumped at the opportunity. I went to this 5 week program, and I basically moved to Boston for about 5 weeks during the summer. I think I was in 11th grade at that time, going into my senior year. And that summer I moved to Boston, and I was there for five weeks. And you know, it was pretty good. It was tough. I took all these ensembles and these classes, and it was my first time living in the city more or less by myself. So it was like a really weird adjustment. But I it was hard. It was hard, but I did okay. I did a little bit beyond what I guess you would say average. I did okay where I was able to pass for the most part some of my classes, but some of it was very, very hard, and it definitely kicked my butt. But I got exposed to, it was amazing because I had, you know, there were classmates that were from all over the world that were there. So I was meeting people from all around the world. I had like two roommates. One was from Alabama and the other one was from Egypt. So it was just really great, and it was the first time I heard like jazz and fusion and funk, and it was all like totally over my head. But it was just the exposure element, and I had no idea. It didn't make any sense to me, but it was such a new. It just brought me into a whole new realm of like of you know uncharted territory as far as checking out new things. And but then when I went to school, it was when I actually started and I became a full time student. It was one of the hardest experiences ever. It was so intense. It was like going. I felt like from stories that I've heard of people who go into like the military, or like go into the Marines or like a boot camp scenario. It felt like that's what I was in. Like it was brutal, and it was. There were many times where it was so hard, and the level of the players that were there, like especially people who were graduating, they were so good that I never questioned like maybe I shouldn't do this. I came close, and like where I felt like I don't know if I have what it takes because it's just too hard and it's so competitive, and the level of some of these guys and girls was just beyond anything I could comprehend. I never got to the point of where I was going to give it up, but I was really questioning all the time, like this is completely insane, and it was so disorienting because of that. And after like my first semester, I finally kind of got my bearings, and I kind of was able to focus a little bit more. And then it was still intense, uh, really intense, but I finally got my bearings, and I was able to kind of like focus on what I did, what I needed to do, and I and then I was I was able to go and kind of concentrate in a lot more of the classes, and I did okay. On one side, it was one of the hardest experiences I ever had, but also one of the greatest experiences I had. And that's where I got exposed to like Miles and Tony Williams and all this great music. And so, but getting back to the film stuff, it with the Quantum, another music analogy, when the pandemic hit, I've always like loved listening to jazz as a fan, and years years had gone by when I finally kind of developed a taste to like listen to jazz and seek it out. And around the time when I started to try to uh, technically how to play jazz on drum set. Um, but when the pandemic hit, I went on, and I've always listened to jazz, and I listen to jazz all the time. But when the pandemic hit, I started listening to a lot of jazz, where there were like weeks and months on end where that's all I was listening to. I was listening to a lot of Wayne Shorter, a lot of Miles, Freddie Hubbard, Bill Evans. I was like literally that's at one point that's all I was listening to, and it was a funny time because I was well, it was emotionally it was really hard, but I was listening to all of this jazz, but I was listening to it like all the time, and that's all I was kind of listening to. And at the same time, I started writing music for Quantum, newer tunes. And after like, I kind of wrote about maybe 5 or 6 tunes, and it was just me. We weren't rehearsing. The band wasn't active. We weren't playing any gigs, and we weren't even rehearsing at that point. I was just basically home writing some material and come up with some ideas. I realized after some time had gone by and I had these songs kind of more at a point of where I felt they were ready. I started hearing like all this jazz I've been listening to. I felt like it was really influencing the newer music, and it was like, huh, like this is interesting. 'Cause I've always loved jazz, and it's always been, a part of, and it's always been an influence on the music that I write for the band. But I felt like the newer material, because my head was so concentrated on listening to that kind of stuff, it was even more of an influence. I could hear it more and more. It was so like the newer material kind of took on that, you know, uh, those kinds of characteristics. And I hear that more and more in some fusion stuff too. But you know, but at the end of the day, it's the you know even now I feel like when I watch a movie, and I watch a lot of movies, it could be something with a character in the movie I really love, or the generalist, something from based off of the aesthetics or the lighting, the soundtrack, or just the way the story unfolds or the tone of the movie. Every now and then, when I have a song that I've written, or I look back at a song that I have written in the past, or something I'm working on now, and I can kind of hear an influence from something from a movie, and I hear that more and more, and it's always kind of an interesting, weird process. But anyway, so today's show is all about this is the next installment for Friday 13th, and this one is already well. There's a ways to go, but this has been a lot of fun. It's been a cool adventure trying to, or watching all of these movies back to back. I haven't really done this. When I bought this box set, I watched the whole thing through. It was a couple of years ago, and there's 8 movies in this box set. So there's about four or five other films that are not included in the box set that I have all of those movies on DVD and Blu-ray. So I'm gonna watch those too, and conclude it with the last one, the last Friday 13th that came out about 10 or 11 years ago now, which I actually really like, and that was the last one that came out. And so that's going to be the kind of the conclusion of the whole thing. So, but it's been fun watching them all together. And I have not seen, you know, for some reason I watched Friday 13th Part 5 A New Beginning. I watched it last night. And for some reason I forgot a lot about this movie. I don't know why, cuz it's been a couple of years since I've seen it. Cuz I've seen the first, obviously the first one, the first Friday 13th, and I've seen the second one a lot, and particularly chapter 4, the final chapter, or part 4, the final chapter. I've seen that one a bazillion times. I've seen all of them a lot, but those 2 or 3 movies I've seen, the most. But I haven't really seen this one. I've seen it a lot, but not as much. So it was interesting watching it last night in concession with the other movies. And this was directed by Danny Steinman, and it came out in 1985. Um, it's got a pretty good cast. John Shepard is in this. Um, and one of the cool things, too, is that it has, it's a franchise, but it has an interesting original take on where the franchise goes. Debbie Sue Varhus, Suzanne Bateman, and Corey Feldman is in this briefly. Dominic Braccio, and for and Shavar Ross, who's great in this. There's also the guy who actually takes on the Jason role, Dick Wynand, is actually really great. And for the franchise, I felt like this was a movie, and that really kind of broke away from the formula that's kind of made this whole franchise what it is. I feel like it had some general originality, particularly around the Jason Voorhees character. I thought they did something really cool and interesting, and gave you something new. But yet, it still got that formula. But it came out in 1985, and again, like I said, I hadn't really watched it in a long time, and I forgot how great it is. It's got some really great kills. Again, the story I feel like is very cool. It's original, but yet it sticks with the formula. It doesn't go too off the path as far as what you expect for the franchise, but it gives you something new and original. It's and I felt like it where it leaves off. It gives you a sense of where you're. Well, after I finished, I felt extra excited to watch the next one after that. It really kind of piqued my interest, and I think that's due to what kind of gave me a little extra spark to kind of keep watching, and looking forward to watching the next one. And I think the reason is because it's it has some really original things about it. So, and I feel like at this point it's part 5, so it needed to kind of have some new thing to kind of introduce along with the Friday 13th tropes that you have. Naked teenagers, naked teenagers getting slaughtered by a mass killer, and with an insane amount, insanely high body count, like those kinds of traditional things that you see. Lots of boobs and all those fun things. So, but yeah, it's a great movie, really great. I got this, and again, this was part of the Blu-ray set, and it has uh, some really cool special features. The original name too of this film, and it was more so after Friday the 13th, the final chapter, the Paramount Studios had, they were like, this is the final chapter. We're not, at one point, they decided that they were not going to make any more movies, and this was going to be it, like the definitive, final chapter, like the title says. But it was, a huge, huge commercial hit, so they decided to obviously make another one. And they got a whole new cast and a new director and wrote a pretty interesting script. And the original title was called Repetition, which I thought was really interesting. And it was used for basically to try to keep this new one top secret. They the actors and people who were asked and who auditioned for the film didn't knew it was a horror movie, but they had no idea that it was going to be a Friday the 13th film. So they kept the film under wraps, and so they used this title called Repetition. And then after they secured the cast and they had everything green lighted, that's they obviously said, well, this is going to be this new franchise, this new movie and the continuation of this franchise. And I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, this is Jason Dean. Stay tuned for the next show. Check out my YouTube channel if you get a chance, please and thank you. And if you can, like it and subscribe. And really excited about the next show, and the whole fun conclusion to this whole odyssey. Cheers. Have a great day.